I think that most of us would acknowledge the wonderful technology in our lives can have a dark side. It begins with distraction and lack of productivity, but if we're not careful, it can lead to full-blown addiction. In this video, I want to look specifically at how video games affect children's brains, along with some more general applications about how screens affect brains in general. And then in the following video, we'll look at tips for how to manage technology as a family. Let's start by talking about dopamine. Never heard of it? Essentially, dopamine is something that God created our bodies to produce to make us feel good. When we do a task, our body produces dopamine and it incentivizes that task. If you eat food, your body releases dopamine and you feel good. Finish your homework, more dopamine, you feel good about accomplishing the task. God even uses dopamine to make sure the human race continues reproducing. You guessed it, having sex gives you a big old dose of dopamine. When functioning normally, dopamine can be a great motivator. However, we found two different things that short-circuit our dopamine production and kick it into high gear. Any guesses as to what those two things are? One is hardcore drugs like cocaine and heroin, and the other is playing video games. Think I'm exaggerating? Look up the research for yourselves. Drugs cause your body to release huge amounts of dopamine all at once, while video games produce less but very rapidly. Really, all screens can have this effect, though it's the most pronounced in video games. There's actually such a strong correlation in what drugs and video games do in your brain that some researchers have started referring to video games as digital cocaine. So what does your body do when dopamine production goes off the charts? Well, it doesn't matter if it's caused by drugs or by video games, the response is the same. Your body senses that something is wrong, so it starts throttling back dopamine production. But this can lead to a horrible downward spiral because the drug addict or the video game addict expects to reach a certain level of high from the dopamine. But as their body throttles back and produces less dopamine, they have to do more drugs or do more video games in order to get the same high that they previously could achieve. But then when they reach that high again, their body throttles back dopamine even further so that they have to do more drugs or play more video games. And it really is an awful cycle. Drugs and games aren't the only things that can make your dopamine production go crazy. Really, all addictions function this way, from addictions to gambling and pornography, all the way down to shopping addictions and addiction to social media. Dr. Nicholas Carteris, in his book Glow Kids, notes that all addictive drugs and addictive behaviors, like gambling and video gaming, provide a shortcut to this reward process, which floods the nucleus accumbens with dopamine. So what does all this mean for kids and technology? Well, unfortunately, kids are especially susceptible to technology addiction because their brains aren't fully formed yet. They don't fully form until their mid-20s. Video games are extremely addictive. Kids are extremely susceptible to addiction. You see the problem. If left unchecked, kids essentially enter this downward spiral where they lose their ability to produce dopamine. And because of that, they lose their ability to care about life or about ordinary things. The wonders of nature lose their appeal because nature isn't as flashy and fast as a video game. Simple tasks like finishing homework, which should have given a moderate hit of dopamine, now gives nothing. Kids either become restless and unfocused or entirely apathetic. By the way, if that description sounds like a kid with ADHD, it might be. Now, I'm no medical doctor, but I have read several medical doctors that speculate about the connection between screens, video games especially, and ADHD. After all, American boys are 10 times more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD than they were 30 or 40 years ago, before the prevalence of all these screens and games in our society. And here's the really scary part. Do you know what ADHD medication is? It's synthetic dopamine. It's dopamine that we give kids to replace the dopamine that they can no longer produce for themselves. The dopamine we give them helps them to be able to focus and concentrate and care again because they're losing that ability. Now, if your child has ADHD, I am not saying it's because they've been playing too many video games or watching too much TV. However, it may not hurt to have them cut back on those activities and just see what happens. The human brain is very resilient. If dopamine production is lessened, given time of rest, it will bounce back. When dealing with children and screen addiction, Dr. Carteris recommends slowly weaning them off until they reach a full digital detox. That may sound extreme, and maybe it is, but I'll let you be the judge of that. Either way, I strongly recommend that you read more on this subject because we barely have even scratched the surface. One of the best books out there is Dr. Carteres's book, Glow Kids: How Screen Addiction is Hijacking Our Kids and How to Break the Trance. In the next video, we'll look at some practical tips for achieving a healthy balance of technology in your home.